events that I participated in. One was in Washington, when we were in a room and the lights were dimmed. And I vowed that whenever I see lights being dimmed in any room, I will immediately leave. And the other one, Reverend Msunkutu, you may be interested in. I usually phone the SG when we undertake international visits and report to him that we are leaving and going to this and that country and all that. So when I told him that we were going to the Vatican, he said, our president, kwangathi singacela ukuthi izono zethu ziyoxolelwa le ku-Vatican. So then I immediately said to him, I said, why don't you write all your sins down? And I invited all the other 6 officials to write their sins down so that when I have the occasion to meet the Holy Father, the Pope, I should hand them to the Pope, and maybe that will be safe passage to have sins forgiven. So I did meet the Pope, but I forgot to hand those pieces of paper over. So I have with me 6 pages that set out the sins that the ANC officials have jotted down. And I will not tell you whose ones is longest. So, so the sins have been recorded, and one day, Reverend Msunkutu, I'll be able to maybe share them with you. Comrades, it gives me a great pleasure to say a few words this evening on the eve of the 5th National General Council of the African National Congress. And thank you very much for all the business people and various other people who have joined us this evening, and for continuing to support the work of the African National Congress, which has been given the responsibility to transform our country and to build a better life for all. The NGC is an opportunity that the delegates from all our many branches, well more than 4,000 branches, will have from tomorrow for 4 solid days to reflect on the progress or lack thereof that has been made since the ANC's 55th National Conference in December 2022. The NGC will consider what works and what needs to be improved. And we're hoping that we will have brutally honest discussions on all the matters that face our people and our nation. This NGC, as I said, will be bringing together all these delegates from ANC structures from across the country, so that those people who are most directly involved in the implementation of the policies of the ANC and programs can share their own experiences and insights that they are deciphering from the ground. When they gather from tomorrow, delegates will be able to point to several areas of progress and, as I said, lack thereof. After many difficult years, South Africa is entering a period of what I will call economic renewal and social renewal. For decades, our country has had to contend with economic, political, and institutional challenges rooted in our divided past. In recent years, we had to confront crippling energy crises rising unemployment, which is still with us, stagnant economic growth, corruption and the destruction of public institutions during the era of state capture. The global COVID-19 pandemic further set back our recovery, and yet we stayed the course. We persisted, determined to get our economy back on track by implementing far-reaching transformational reforms. This determination is now beginning to pay off as we witness an emerging economic recovery that is testified to by a number of people. Electricity supply has stabilized and Eskom has been returned to operational viability. Together with regulatory changes and substantial private investment in renewable energy, we are laying the foundation for a competitive energy market that will reduce the cost of electricity for households and businesses. At times, we are not quite alive to the fact that by opening the opportunities for renewable energy, utilizing the natural resources that are, if you like, God-given, like the sun and the wind, we have opened up investment opportunities, particularly in the Northern Cape, in the Southern Cape, and in the Western Cape. And now it's beginning to happen in Mpumalanga and also will be happening in Limpopo. Almost more than 100 billion rand has been invested, for instance, in one province in the Northern Cape, which has the highest radiation levels of any area in the world. And those who have invested are testifying to the fact that we do have this wonderful natural resource, the sun, which also shines in Limpopo quite strongly. And if Dr. Ramaphosa was here, he would have told you about how the neutrons are evacuated, and he would use all those scientific terms. We are beginning to utilize the resources that we have. And also in mining, we are beginning to say, in fact, that mining is a rising sun industry. For years, it was seen as a declining industry. And as we open up exploration and the state gets involved in assisting those who want to explore, many more critical minerals are being found. But we've even gone further by convincing the world that we no longer, as South Africa and indeed the African continent, are prepared to countenance the extraction of our natural resources, as in rock, soil, and dust, being carted out of the country without being beneficiated. That has now been accepted, and it has been embraced here in Johannesburg during our G20. Now, that is progress, and we're also seeing steady progress in the logistics sector. The efficiency of our ports is improving, and freight rail lines are becoming opened also to operators who are able to bring in money while the state retains ownership of those lines. More goods are being transported on our railways and through our ports. Public-private partnerships are being forged to unlock finance and accelerate implementation of mass public infrastructure. And I often tell people that some of the things that we had done earlier, we had kind of stopped. For instance, one of the biggest sort of transportation arteries in our country, which is the N3 from Johannesburg to Durban, was financed through a public-private partnership. And through that, we were able to crowd in private sector money to get them to build, to operate, and now they are going to transfer this very valuable asset back to the state. And we've done the same with a number of others, the N4 and all that. And we are now saying we want to reinvigorate all that. And in fact, the Treasury rules are now ready to be laid out so that we are able to open channels for further investment. And as you will all have seen or heard, we're now embarked on the biggest infrastructure build program by allocating 1 trillion rand, the first ever in our country, for us as a country over a 3-year period to spend 1 trillion rand money ticket to boost infrastructure. That is progress. Now, our commitment to macroeconomic stability, continuing, or rather containing inflation, and prudent fiscal management has seen our sovereign risk profile steadily improving. Last month, the S&P upgraded our rating for the first time in nearly 2 decades. The last time they upgraded us was in 2005. For the first time in 20 years, they have upgraded our rating. Now, this happens because of the progress we're making. Today, in the Sunday Times, the Director General of Finance pens an article where he informs all of us that we've now been able to place a Eurobond amounting to something like $3.5 billion, where we made it available. As you know, government raises money through tax and also through raising bonds or offering bonds, long-term bonds, medium-term bonds, and all that. And he was reporting that we've raised, I think it is $3.5 billion on the international capital markets. But he then says the most interesting part is that it was oversubscribed almost 4 times, where the international community is piling in to lend money at low interest rates. Now, that is a phenomenal level of achievement. And it does show that things are beginning to move in a particular direction. And a number of people have characterized that as the green shoots. South Africa's removal from the Financial Action Task Force grey list is a further signal of our commitment to restoring institutional integrity and to rebuilding investor confidence. Yes, we had gone southwards, but now we have been working on the transformational reforms that are enabling us to have the world to look at us and to enable investors to say that we are not the risk that they perceived us to be. And this is due to the work that has been done in government and working with our other stakeholders in government, working in interdepartmental processes that have enabled us to do this. Unemployment is still high, unacceptably high, but it is when the economy begins to turn, when the economy begins to grow, that we will be able to bring the levels of unemployment down. And there is a correlation between higher levels of economic growth and the downward trajectory of unemployment. So when the two happen, we will be able to see levels of unemployment also going down. But government is not sitting back just expecting that the private sector, who are the greater employment creators, that we should rely on them only. There are a number of other programs that we keep embarking upon, particularly aimed at young people, not leaving out those who are 35 and older, through a variety of programs, public employment programs, and so forth. Between July and September, we saw the figures of unemployment changing in a positive way, but it's still not enough. Nearly 250,000 more people were employed, and years ago, when the private sector, the unions and community organizations held a job summit, I think it was at this very venue or somewhere here in Ekurhuleni, they invited me to come and hear their report. And even at that time, I think it was 2019, they said that our economy could only create 375,000 jobs. Now that left me dismayed, because I knew then that almost 300,000 young people enter the job market every year. And I felt that the target was very low. But an earlier job summit had more or less presented more or less the same report. We obviously want to see the job creation levels going much higher, because the number of unemployed people in our country is far too high. Government finances are turning around. We are on track to achieve a third consecutive primary budget surplus, giving us space to steadily reduce our debt to sustainable levels. And these are some of the things that we will be presenting and discussing at the NGC. And we will want the delegates to interface and interact with all these matters and enable us to raise our gaze to a higher level, so that we raise our ambition as we are now beginning to see progress. We are positioning our country as an investment destination of choice. We are strengthening the regulatory environment and improving the ease of doing business. A few weeks ago, I had occasion, together with ministers of DTIC and finance and others, to go to meet the European Union in Brussels. And it was the second summit that we were having with them. And they had come to Cape Town to meet us and had determined or said that they would invest 5 billion euros into our economy. When we went a few weeks ago, they said, but due to the progress that is unfolding in our country, in terms of our economic management and so forth, they will raise that to almost 12 billion rand. So additional 12 billion euros rather, which if you multiply by 22 or 23, it's quite substantial. So the country is beginning to see some of those positive signals. The country has experienced a period of lower inflation, which eases the cost of living pressures on ordinary people. As you well know, the central bank or the Reserve Bank mandate in terms of the Constitution is to focus on the value of money, of our rand. And through that, they are able to determine the interest rates, being influenced by how inflation is playing out. As inflation comes down, that enables the central bank to begin to look at interest rates to also taper down. And with both these key financial or economic indicators tapering down, reduces the cost of living, and it also enables our businesses to borrow money on the cheap so that they can invest and create more jobs. So lower inflation is also leading to a reduction in borrowing costs, boosting demand in the economy and helping to stimulate economic growth. Now, in the midst of a turbulent trade environment and a steep rise in tariffs, we are finding an appetite for South African goods in new markets. And we are trolling many countries in the world. Ministers, the DP and myself are visiting a number of countries so as to reduce our dependence on those countries. And one country can be singled out that have unilaterally imposed higher tariffs on our goods. And as we spread our access to other markets, we reduce our vulnerability just to a few single markets. So we are finding that there's a great deal of appetite in many countries where we visit. And many of those countries actually say they want to reach free trade agreements with us as South Africa, realizing that we are the most industrialized country on the continent, and our workers and our companies do produce good goods that can be sold out to them, both agricultural, through agro-processing and other ways, and other real physical goods. And now we want our mining industry to follow by producing finished products so that we no longer export rock, dust, and soil, but export finished goods that the world needs. Last month, as you all know, we hosted the very first G20 Leader Summit on African soil, which considered and agreed on a number of actions that will benefit the people of South Africa and indeed the world, because the decisions that are taken at the G20 level since it was established 20 years ago have tended to have an influence and an impact on global policies on a number of areas, be they financial, be they economic, be they trade, and now added climate change. Now, we found widespread support among world leaders for our G20 principles of solidarity, equality, and sustainability. There was appreciation of the needs to place the interests of the African continent on the global agenda. For the very first time, the G20 declaration mentioned Africa, I think more than 50 times. Just the word and the name Africa appeared for the first time in such great numbers. And this had been our intention. We had wanted the G20 to be an African-focused G20, and we succeeded in doing so. No matter how others can downplay our G20 hosting, they cannot take away from South Africa and the people of South Africa how successful the G20 was. So a number of important decisions were taken on issues such as debt sustainability, and we made it a point to raise, because countries that host the G20 are allowed or given the opportunity to address or to put on the agenda the priorities that they want the G20 countries to discuss and to agree on. And remembering that the G20 has 85% of the GDP of the world almost resides in the G20, and about 70% of world trade. Now, we raised our priorities. And one of the priorities we raised was the cost of debt for low-income countries or developing economy countries, and also the finance for climate change, and also disaster recovery, and also the beneficiation of critical minerals, as I said right at the beginning. Now, the G20 presidency gave our country an opportunity to showcase to the world the many opportunities in our country for investment, for trade and tourism. And when I addressed the nation, just to thank the people of South Africa, I read out some of the comments that had been made. And one of those that still rings in my head is when one delegate said they've attended all G20s, and the South African G20 was by far the best that they had attended. So that, to me, was great. Now, while NGC delegates reflect on some of these areas of progress, they'll also need to look closely at the challenges that face our country and our movement at this time in point. In particular, they will need to address the challenge of poverty, unemployment, and continuing inequality. They will need to discuss the further actions that we need to take to stimulate further inclusive growth, especially for young people. Now, the NGC will also need to consider the high levels of hunger and malnutrition in our country, particularly as they affect children. It is estimated that nearly 1 in 4 children in our country experience food poverty. This is an emergency that requires urgent and comprehensive response. And this is happening despite all the interventions that the government, that ANC-led government has taken over the years, 30 years, to ensure that there are proper support measures for children, for the destitute, child grants, old age grants, and recently we also introduced the SRD grant. Now, despite all this, we're still finding that there is hunger that needs to be addressed. Now, during the course of the NGC, we will reflect on the quality of life of South Africa's people. We will recognize the great progress that has been made over the few decades, particularly in services such as electricity and water. We will talk about that. It is particularly impressive, for example, that in just over a decade, the percentage of households in formal dwellings, proper houses, has increased from 65% to 85%. Now, if we cast our eyes back to 1994, many of us will remember how either our relatives and how many of our people still lived in mud houses. That has now moved to proper formal dwellings, up to 88%. Now, this is phenomenal increase or improvement. However, as we consider this progress, we must acknowledge severe challenges in the provision of basic services in many communities. And this has to do with how the local government structures have weakened. The NGC will need to tackle these difficult issues. In particular, it will need to look at, yes, how we can strengthen our municipalities. And they will also need to look at the issue of crime and violence and corruption. And we can certainly point to some successes in the efforts that have been made in this regard, and we can look at how state capture has to a large extent been brought to an end, and how initiatives have been taken to deal with the ravages of state capture following the Commission's report. Now, in the face of these challenges, we dare not despair. Rather, we need to redouble our efforts to improve our methods and also to deepen the collaboration amongst social partners to steadily push back against criminals, against corruption. So the NGC is an opportunity to critically examine the state of our country, but it is also an opportunity to reflect on the state of the African National Congress, which is the real engine that should transform our country. And once again, we will refer to progress that is being made to rebuild our structures and empowering our members through political education, and also how they should continue to work in communities. That is the deep conversations that the NGC will need to have. And as before, the African National Congress is able to look at itself very critically and to come up with solutions. And as it is with any organization, we are able to move forward, and sometimes there are times when we either stall. And this is what the NGC is going to look at, to see how we can add momentum in the whole process of the renewal of the African National Congress. So in many ways, this dinner is part of that effort to reach out to all sections of society, and we're grateful that you're here. It is part of the effort to you all to help us rebuild the ANC, and by your mere presence here and by your mere sharing a meal with us, you have chosen to be part of the renewal of the ANC and never giving up on the African National Congress with regard to how the ANC should continue to rebuild our society. And you have chosen to lend your support to a South Africa that belongs to all its people and to the world shaped by solidarity, equality, and sustainability. And for your dedication to this cause, I'd like to applaud you, and I'd like to thank you for being here. And many of you always attend these dinners that are managed and convened by the TG, and I extend our collective gratitude to the Treasurer General and to her team, the PBF, and we say continue with this work, because it is this work that continues to demonstrate that the ANC is alive and the ANC will continue to lead. Thank you for being here.